Hello, this is Karthik, and today I'm going to be doing a D3.js tutorial. And in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to build a bar graph. And this is the example that we'll be working through. And this is also animated. So let me refresh the page so that you can see the animation. Okay, so the data that I'm working with is the GDP by nation. So I have some countries here, and each one of these countries has a bar going upward, and it has the GDP value printed on top of the bars. Okay, to get started, I'm going to open up Brackets, which is the IDE that I use to work on my D3 visualizations. And in here, I have some files opened up for the project. That is the index.html, the style sheet, the gdp.csv, which is our data file, and the gdp bar graph.js, which is where we're going to write the D3 JavaScript code to generate our bar graph. So in my HTML file, I just have the basic setup where I linked my style sheet, linked the d3.js CDN source, which you can get from d3.js.org. And then in the body, I just have the title of my visual, and then I am linking in my gdp bar graph.js, the script file inside the body. Okay, so now let's take a look at the data file. Okay, so this is the data file, gdp.csv, and it has the country names and the GDP values associated with each of the country. On the first line, I have country GDP that represents the variable name in the column. So in this column, the column country has all the country names, and column GDP has all the GDP values. And this is my GDP bar graph.js file, which is my JavaScript file, and this is where we'll be writing our JavaScript code. The first thing we'll do is to define our margin. So our margin, we're going to have top, bottom, right, and left margins to help us append the visual or draw the visual inside a SVG container. So you can look at the margin convention for more explanation on what I'm doing here. And you will see as we go along the tutorial why I chose these arbitrary values. You can change these, but I chose these because I know that I'll be needing space at the bottom for my labels of the bars, and then on the left side I need a little bit more space to put in the title of my y-axis. And as for the top and the right, since I'm not putting anything, that's why I've left them relatively small compared to the bottom and the left attribute. Now I'm going to specify the width, and now I'm going to specify the height. After we define our margin, let's go ahead and define the SVG. And inside the SVG, we're going to use an element called G, which is used to group, which is kind of a container that's used to group objects together. And in our example, we'll be grouping the bars and the x-axis and the y-axis. To get a better understanding of what SVG is, you can visit the developer.mozilla.org website, where they have explanation on SVG and its elements like the rectangle, circle, and G, and many more. Okay, so to define the SVG, we're going to say var SVG equals d3.select the body. So I'm selecting the body, and that's where I'm going to append my SVG. So I'm appending my SVG onto the body, and I'm going to give it some attributes. So the SVG has the attributes of width and height. So we're specifying the width and the height of the SVG, and I'm using a little bit of a different syntax than the usual syntax that you see on D3 examples. I will be grouping my attributes together. After specifying the SVG's height and the width, now we're going to specify its, we're going to append the G element. After declaring the SVG, now we want to center the SVG, and we can use the style CSS to do that. So we're going to go ahead and say SVG, and we can say the background color so we get an idea of what our SVG looks like, so we can get a visual of it. So you can choose one, but it's not really required. I'm going to delete it after, and I'm going to say margin dot left. It's going to be auto, and margin dot right will be auto, and I'm going to display as block. And let's go ahead and run this and see what we get. Okay, so there we can see our SVG. This is the color of the background color of the SVG, and it's centered. And there are no errors in our console, so that's good. Now we're going to move on to defining our scale on the axis, and we want to use the x-axis to represent the country names and the y-axis to represent the GDP values. So let's go ahead and define the x and y scales. So our x scale will be d3 dot scale dot ordinal, and we're going to say range round bands, and we're going to specify that it's going to be from 0 till the maximum width value, the width value, and I'm going to pass in two values here that define the spacing or the pattern between the each of our bars. And if you don't understand this, it's always a good idea to go check out the D3 API reference to know the difference between ordinal versus linear scale, which is what we're going to use for defining the y scale. So for y scale, we use the linear scale instead of the ordinal, and there is a difference between the two. One of the main differences is that for ordinal, is used for text space. So since our x-axis will contain the country names and they're represented as string, we should use ordinal. And for the y-axis, will be represented with data from the CSV file, which is the GDP value. So we're going to use linear for that. And I'm going to specify its range, and the range will be from height to 0. In SVG, it's a little different. The axes are different. The height is for the maximum height, so which is at the bottom of the SVG, and the origin of the SVG is at the top of the SVG, 0, 0. So we're going to mention the range will be from height to 0 because we want the bars to grow upward rather than growing from top to bottom. Find the axis, the x and the y axis. So var x-axis, it's going to be d3.svg.axis and dot scale. I'm going to call it the x scale now. And for the orient, we're going to place the x-axis at the bottom of our SVG. And now for the y-axis, we do the same, d3.svg.axis and dot scale. I'm calling the y scale. And for the orient, we are going to put this on the left side of the SVG. After defining the scales and the axis, now we're going to go ahead and import the data. and we're going to use d3.csv function to import our data. There's also other functions such as d3.tsv and d3.json, and you can use those to import a TSV file or a JSON file respectively. Since we're working with the CSV file, we're going to use d3.csv. I'm going to pass in the file name, which is gdp.csv, and I'm going to now define an anonymous function. An anonymous function it could be something new for some people, so it's a JavaScript thing. So if you have any questions about it, you can always Google about them and see some examples. And I'm going to specify the error and data. So always remember to close your functions. Sometimes it could be hard to debug if you don't. Okay, so now I'm going to put in an if statement. So if there is an error, it's always a good thing to check errors. After we check for error, and if there is no error, we're going to go ahead and move on to converting the data to proper format. So in our gdp.csv, we have GDP values which are represented as numbers, but sometimes they can be represented as strings, and we don't want to work with the string number. So instead of doing that, we rather convert the string representation of the number to an actual number. To do that, D3 has a way to do that, and we're going to use the plus operator to do that. So we're going to iterate through each one of our data. So data dot for each. Let's say d dot gdp equals d plus d dot gdp. And we're going to do the same for the country, d dot country. Notice these are the same. GDP and country are the same names as the names represented here for the variable. Equals d dot country. We don't have to put a plus sign in front of the d dot country because it's a string, and we want to use the string as it is. And to confirm, we can always say console.log d.gdp, and this will print out the values inside the console. So let's see if we can see those. Okay, so we have an error. Line 35. Oh, oops, it's supposed to be. Yeah, that looks correct. Oh yeah, there needs to be a comma here. Okay, hopefully that fixes it. Ordinal. Why is that? Oh, it's misspelling. Yeah. Careful with your spelling, guys. Okay, there we go. Alright, so after we convert the data, you can see that the GDP values are represented as numbers. Okay, so after we do that, now we should sort the data. I mean, you don't have to, but I want to sort the data from greatest to smallest. So I'm going to use an inbuilt function sort to do this for me. So data dot sort. After importing the data and converting the data to our proper format, we're going to specify the domains of the X and Y scales. To specify the domains of the X and Y scale, we're going to call in or define variables X scale and Y scale. So X scale dot domain, and in this domain we're going to map the data dot map, and the function d, and we're going to return d dot country. So all we really want to show on our X scale are the countries, the labels. Okay. And now we want to specify the domain of the Y scale. And in this one, we're going to say the domain will be from will be the values from minimum to max. The minimum we know is going to be 0. There's nothing below 0, and the max could be any number When you have a large data set, it's good to use d3 max function, which will find the largest value or the maximum value inside your data. So d, and I'm going to return the d.gdp. So it's going to go through your GDP values and return the maximum value or the maximum domain, the input. After now we will actually draw our rectangle bars to represent each one of our data. So draw the bars, and let's say we're going to draw the bars onto the SVG. So SVG dot select all. We use select all because the element rect does not exist in our SVG yet. It's going to exist after we pass in our data, iterate through our data values, and append a rectangle for each one of those data. So pass in the data, iterate through, and append a rect for each one of our data. And a rectangle in SVG has 4 crucial attributes, such as the x, the y, x and y position, and the width and the height of the rectangle. And we're going to use our defined x scale, y scale, and the axes to determine the x and y position and the width and the height of our bars. So attribute, I'm going to go ahead and group them. So the first one I'll do is the x position, which will be a function of d, and I'm going to return the x scale of d dot country. And after that, I'll specify the y position, which we return y scale of d.gdp. Now we specify the width of our rectangles or the bars, which will be x scale dot range band. And if you're not sure about the functions and the methods I'm using, it's always a good idea to check the D3 API reference. We define the height, and this will take a function to return height minus y scale of d.gdp. Let's go ahead and run this and see what we get. Alright, so we have our bars, each one scaled to its representative value. So obviously the highest value is 14.9, and we could see that. And the next highest are at 5.93 and 5.49, and the values are there. Now let's actually append those values on top of the bars. To do that, we're going to append our draw our x-axis and then also the y-axis, and then after that we're going to append the values on top of the bars. So draw the x-axis. To do that, we're going to do svg dot append. We're going to group them together, so we're using the g element dot attribute. I'm going to define a class, and I'm going to name it x-axis. And then I'm going to transform it or translate it to the bottom. There are multiple ways to do this, but I'm doing this one because it's easier. Okay, and now we're going to call the x-axis, and what that does is it takes our defined x-axis and appends our x-axis onto the SVG. So the call here is calling d3.svg.axis, and it's going to orient it at the bottom, and that call method is going to take care of that. That's going to append our x-axis, and we can go ahead and see if that works. And yes, see, we do see our names or the labels of the countries associated with the bars. Obviously they're overlapping, but we can fix that. To fix that, we're going to rotate the labels 60 degrees so that they'll be slanted and they don't overlap. Let's go ahead and also append our y-axis. Dot attribute dot class, and I'm going to call this the y-axis. I'm defining a class so I can later on apply some CSS elements on it, and I'm going to go ahead and I don't need to transform this. I can just go ahead and call my y-axis since. Okay, so now let's go ahead and we don't have to transform the y-axis because it's already oriented at the y-axis. We have to transform the x-axis because it'll orientate it at the top. So if I remove this, you're going to see that it's going to be at the top. So we're going to have to include that, so that way the axis will come down to the bottom. Okay, let's go back to fixing the overlapping labels, which is the situation that we see right here. To fix that, we're going to first select all the text elements, and then we're going to apply transform and then rotate, transform and rotate, and I'm going to rotate it minus 60 degrees, and let's see where that takes us to. Okay, so we do see our text rotated 60 degrees, but it's kind of going into the chart, so we want to bring it out more. And to do that, we're going to specify some of the delta y and delta x positions. So then I dx, and I'm going to say this one will be minus 0.8 em, and for dy it will be 0.25. Just keep in mind that these are arbitrary values. You're going to have to try some of these and figure out which one works best for your visual. And as you can see, it's still not making a big difference. So we're going to call in another stylistic element called text anchor. So call the style function, apply the style text anchors, so this, and we're going to pull it towards the end, so this will pull the labels out. Let's see, yes, there you go. So it pulled the labels out, and you can see all the labels are there, and you can change the font size so that the labels don't get cut off. There's three types of values you can put here: end, middle, and start. So if I put middle, it's going to kind of position the text in the middle, but we don't want that. Since that's overlapping, we're going to change it back to the end. Now we're going to set the font size of our text, of our labels. Font size, and I'll make it about 12 pixels, and that should fix the overlapping issue or that should fix everything. It fixes the overlapping issue and also the labels going out of the SV. So we have our labels now, and now we're going to apply some stylistic elements to our axis so they look nicer. To do that, we're simply going to go to the style sheet and say dot axis path. So we're modifying we're applying stylistic elements to the path and the line. Dot axis line, and we're gonna fill it with nothing or none. The stroke will be also just that, and the shape rendering, not image threshold, will be crisp edges. Let's go ahead and see what that does to our graph. Okay, there we go. Now we have crisp edges, so let's get rid of the background color. Now let's go back to our script file and finish off the rest of the stuff like animation and appending the text. So before we go on to the animation, let's append the text, the GDP values on top of our bar. And to do that, we're going to call svg.selectAll text element. So label the bars. svg dot select all text element, and we're going to pass in the data. We have to pass in the data. We're going to iterate over the data, and we're going to append the text. And the text function will take an anonymous function of d, and we want to return d.gdp value. That's the value that we want to place on top of the bar. Okay, but we also have to position it. So let's go ahead and see if we get any of those numbers. Okay, so all the numbers are there. They're just kind of overlapping over there. So that means we have to fix its x and y position of the text. So to do that, we're gonna specify the x and y position of the text. So for the x, it's gonna return, well, we're gonna define the function d, and it's going to return the x scale of d.country, and we want to center the label text inside the bar. So we're going to say x scale dot range band divided by 2. What this does is it's going to put the label in the center of the bar. So the bar has a certain width, let's say of 20 pixels. It's going to put the label at the 10th pixel. Okay, and let's close this. Now let's specify the y attribute, and this will also take an anonymous function, and it will return the y scale of g.gdp. So we want the position of the text to match with the position of the height of the bars, and I'm going to give about 12 pixels of padding. Okay, I'm going to close that, and let's see what that does to our graph. Okay, it's loading. Alright, so okay, all the labels are there, it's just that they're not brought down or they're not positioned on top of the bar. So we're going to fix that, and there's also an error. So I'm going to fix that error too on 101. Oh, this is supposed to be d.gdp. I think this will fix the error. Okay, let's refresh it. Okay, we have to fix the labeling so that we can actually see it. It's actually in black color and it's also not centered, so we're going to use text anchor and fill in white color to fix that. So I'm going to call in my style attribute fill and fill it in with white color so our text becomes white. To fix the position of the label, so I'm going to use the text anchor element and put the label in the middle. And now we could see the label and it's centered, and the X and the Y axis are there. Now we're going to add some color and transition. Before we add the color and the transition, let's go ahead and also fix the font size of our Y labels. Let's see if that changes the things. Oops. Misspelled. S-T-Y-L-E. Okay. Okay, there we go. So now our font is consistent with the labeling. Now we can add some transition effects and also the color effect. So right after we append the rectangle, we're going to set the attribute of the height of the bar to 0, and the position Y will also be at the height, so which will be at the very bottom. And we're going to say transition, use the transition function dot duration. I'm going to give it 3000 milliseconds, so 3 seconds. And I'm going to use the delay function, so that way we'll have a nice smooth transition, and the delay will be based on the data. So function di, and I'm going to return each of the bars at about 200 milliseconds. Okay, so let's see how that works. Let's refresh. Oops, we have an error. Okay, where is the error? On line 89. Okay, misspell here. F-U-N-C, function. Okay, and there we go. That fixes it. And now we have the transition that's smooth and the labels are there. Now let's add the color. So the color is going to be darker for higher values, or and lighter for smaller values. So you're going to see a different shade of blue. To create the shade of blue, we're just going to go and add the style element. So at the end of the bars, we're going to say dot style and put in and do the fill element and do function d comma I, and I'm going to return a different shade of blue for each one of the datas or the GDP values. So 20, 20, and then plus, this is where I'm going to put in my value so that the color code for blue changes at every data. And that should do it. RGB, not RGD. Okay, so this should be RGB, not RGD. And there should be times, not plus. So let's see if that fixes our errors. Okay, there we go. Now we see a darker shade of blue here and a lighter shade here. So, and we also have the animation as well, the labels and everything. So this is the end result of our bar graph example with D3JS. Thank you for watching. Please comment below on how else I can improve and what sorts of other D3JS tutorials you guys would like to see. Thanks for watching.